Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started with our talk. Thanks for everybody for coming and listening to us. Hopefully not blather on too much. Not going to be as funny as Miko, which is too bad because he was really funny this morning. That's going to be a hard act to follow for us, but we'll do what we can do. So we're going to talk to you this afternoon about adventures in dynamic network segmentation. Alternatively, the title of our talk was, and that's how I got this scar. So, kind of a unique situation here. I'm going to be presenting alongside Shannon, but a little bit about myself. I'm Rick Lull. I'm currently a consulting engineer at SciComm Technologies here in Richmond. And for SciComm, that is where our security blue team kind of resides in the organization. Doing IT 20 years, most of it security related, now for about half. Holding a couple of current certs. You can see, of course, I put it up there, all the different certs. I know there's lots of cert hate, and I mostly agree, but unfortunately at this stage of the game, it is what it is. So I think until we can figure out something better as an industry, they're going to be with us. So this is the first time I've talked at RVAsec. I've come every year. I've always enjoyed them. So my goal to be as a presenter is I want to see the STFU sign.
Hi, Shannon Yeaker here. Worked with Rick at another company, and I'm the project manager and lead consultant in GRC practice at Impact Makers. I've been over 20 years in IT, mostly in GRC, governance, risk and compliance, security, that sort of thing. Have a few certs, and I also put up with Rick's shenanigans. So that is why I'm here.
And there are many shenanigans.
Okay, so you will notice the theme of cats. Don't forget that you'll see cats throughout this whole presentation today. So we're going to go over what and why, like why do you care? What are the benefits and risks? What are some requirements and kind of steps to delivering network segmentation? And hopefully you guys will have a little fun along the way.
So dynamic network segmentation, really what this is this is a way that you can police what comes and attaches to your network. So whether we're talking wired or wireless, you might even extend this definition to include VPNs, business partners, things like that. Again, you're building a foundation to have an approach of defense in depth. So what this means is, again, foundation that you can get an awful lot of benefits from, but to do this in a thorough manner isn't without some risk. And that's one of the things that we want to give an awareness of, is to know, okay, you can get good benefits, but don't just go into this blindly. So, start with some benefits. Obvious stuff. Control what connects to your network. That's probably obvious why you would do this thing. You can, if you think back to the keynote this morning, this is something that Miko touched on a little bit, talking about, there's all kinds of stuff that's out there no one knows. And again, part of a good security program is having asset control, knowing what you got, what's out there, where is it? And then, of course, once you've answered those questions, you can figure out what's it doing here, what's it supposed to be doing here. So, you're going to control who's connected to the network, and that way it means you're going to figure out who they are, which now means you're going to be able to configure levels of access to apply to them, and ultimately that's going to help you limit lateral movement of an attacker who somehow gains a foothold in your environment. Some of the not so obvious pieces that shake out here, this is going to help you giving you an asset list, or giving you an excuse to make one, let's say. You might also find that this is going to help you with a endpoint standardization movement or push. And again, you're going to be able to have hard data to provide to your leadership of what's out there. And sometimes, from an engineering standpoint, oh, there's this out there, there's that, there's this machine that's Windows XP, or I got this thing that's like a black box, and I think it's some Unix variant, but not really sure, it just showed up one day. Being able to translate that into good, hard figures to bring your management is another benefit of this, that sometimes it's a challenging engagement with your leadership to say, well, it's out there. And they go, well, prove it to me. Just because you saw it once doesn't mean it's always there. So again, this gives you that leverage to present to say, hey, here's hard data that shows I've got these other pieces out here. So not without some risk, of course. We're talking about the network. And it's gotten to the point now that we expect networks to be everywhere all the time. So I mean, you're sure almost everybody here has probably got a phone in their pocket. They might have a tablet in their bag, a laptop, all kinds of stuff. Turn the wireless on and look to see how many wireless networks you see. I mean, we've put the network, basically the network is now everywhere. And that's a fundamental thing, and people have now taken it for granted, and they are reliant upon this service. So if you come to them and say, hey, by the way, we're going to start limiting how access is granted to the network, people are going to have a little bit of an issue with that. So you need to be prepared when you go into this that you're going to be able to tell them, we're going to be able to work with you, we're going to be able to understand your concerns, and be able to continue for you to do your business process while adding some security. So this is my things that you run over slide. That was probably a phrase I've said so many times that Shannon got sick of me sick of saying this all the time. But again, you have a network. It's a giant thing. It's a bunch of stuff connected. So what's out there? So your standard stuff, PCs, of course, because there's everywhere. So PCs, there's printers, probably got voice over IP phones, wireless access points obviously are out there. But there's a bunch of other stuff that's out there that you're going to see. So some of the stuff that we ran over that we found that we didn't even know, time clocks, didn't figure that all the way. Found bootleg ESX servers under people's desks. Who knew? Door badge systems for access control, cell phone boosters, credit card terminals. Hundreds of credit card terminals. Medical devices, other embedded systems, so SCADA systems, PLCs, plant monitoring, all that kind of stuff is out there too. And then, of course, one of my favorites, as you can see here with the nice picture, courtesy of our marketing folks, vending machines. A couple of them.
Sorry, Rick, there'll be things you don't know about. So in working on the project, there are some things are identified as Microsoft devices, and in Word and healthcare happen to be medical devices, but they have an embedded OS. So understanding there's things you do not know that will come up that you'll discover.
A couple other things, and I touched on this a little briefly, talking about endpoint standardization. So ultimately, we're talking about getting things connected to the network. They have to have some way to connect. Technically, that piece is called a supplicant, and that's what leverages the authentication into your network access. So most modern operating systems have this capability built in, which is nice. Some of them are better than others, frankly. So Windows 7 works, assuming that the machines haven't been fooled with too heck of a much. Like I said, know the hotfixes, be prepared to apply them. More modern versions of Windows seem to be a little better, a little more flexible when it comes to that. Most of the modern Mac OSs that we saw, we messed around with, they work. You, of course, have to keep in mind that they do PEEP only. So no EAP TLS, no EAP fast, certainly no EAP MD5, not that you'd want to use that. Anyway, a little more configuration, maybe manually, depending on how many Macs you have in your environment. The place that we were at doesn't officially have Macintoshes, so the connectivity for those was kind of a one-off, but we figured out a way to do it, did it, and was able to provide that procedure to our Mac community. Last thing I want to touch on, again, Linux distributions have this functionality. I was fooling around. I got a Debian machine to work, and then I had to put it to the side because I had to focus on basically on our Windows machines and then the rest of the stuff that's out there. So before we dive any deeper into the technical realms, I kind of wanted to hit the highlights again on what we're talking about from a requirements baseline. So first thing, reasonably modern network infrastructure. Seems pretty simple, except for the fact that then you got to keep in mind, well, we built this network, we have it available forever for our users, so we might not be where we want to be. So keep in mind, in this particular project, we ended up actually speccing to replace 500 access devices. across a network that's something like 50,000 nodes. So not an inconsequential amount of money to be spent there, or the amount of time that it would take you to refresh all that hardware. Of course, you'll need a radio server. You need internal PK infrastructure. This place was an Active Directory environment. A lot of places are. Leverage the built-in AD stuff, please. It's just easier. I know you can do neat stuff with OpenSSL, and you got AD, go ahead and use it, make it easy. Most important thing before you do this, management buy-in. Without this, you're basically going to be dead in the water. I mean, you're done before you start. A couple other things that can speed your journey along. Add-on supplicant for your Windows machines, because this is giving you a baseline that's consistent across the entire board. You're also going to hopefully get some additional options with this supplicant. One of the big ones is down the future road, you can have the ability to do some posture assessments. Another piece that can be helpful is if you have any sort of profiling features on your radio servers. And when I say profiling, my meaning is the ability for the radio server to get intelligence about the endpoints it sees out there and being able to give you information about them, such as, oh, I captured the host name. Oh, I captured the operating system type. Oh, I captured the MAC address. Oh, I captured open ports or what have you. So again, you can help to get a handle on what's out there. And the nice thing about sometimes these same features give you the ability to write a rule to say, okay, if you see this attribute, this attribute, this attribute, enforce this rule. So instead of having to go machine by machine by machine, if you've ever try to do something like this with port security, back in the old days, to restrict how many MAC addresses could connect on a switch port, and you're like, oh man, I hate this because I got to keep changing rules around. Well, this gives you that dynamic flexibility. You write one rule, it applies everywhere, and you don't have to fool with it anymore.
So here's the cats theme again. What you see is herding cats. Keep thinking about that, herding cats. So what I want to talk about here is kind of the management of the implementation of this effort. As Rick mentioned earlier, we ended up doing a massive infrastructure upgrade because reasonably good does not mean end of support. So we found a lot of end of support devices that we had to replace. The top row is kind of the infrastructure piece, either replacing the switches, upgrading the iOS, and having a separate check to ensure that compliance and compatibility. Then the next one is implementing the supplicant. And what we found is a native supplicant did not work, so we had to implement a supplicant. Now the deal with this is the supplicant causes issues or affects business processes, one of which was fast user switching. We had stakeholders who are used to switching users often. That is a security issue because it's a security impersonation issue, but there was a lot of heartburn. So part of this, and you'll see later, is communicate early, communicate often. What we do try to do with this project is not impact business processes. The next piece is, okay, once you have your switches upgraded, your iOS upgraded, you want to understand, based on priority order, what devices attach to those switches. And then you identify the missing devices to say, okay, what are we working on? Do the data flows, because what we want to know is how do we enable the security, whitelisting if you will, and disable or block anything that should not be there. Without knowing what the devices are, what it talks to, and what talks to it, you're not able to do that. And then the last piece is phone certificates. So deploying certificates on phones, we have a bulk load procedure that we use for that. Then we have change control, stakeholder communication, and implementation. Everything to the left, as you can see, can be done simultaneously. There are some interaction points, but we can continue. We have been moving along the path. One thing I do want to point out is with the devices and data flows, you don't have to do all the closets at once. You don't have to do it waterfall. You can do an iterative process, 6, 8, 10 closets, so that you can start implementing security, reducing risk, improving security as you're continuing to identify and define. So I want to let folks know that we constantly moving through this. So now we talked about what we need to do. Now there is an art to this. Communicate early, communicate often. When I mentioned earlier the issue we identified with The supplicant is it disables fast user switching. So what it should do, it's a security feature. We absolutely want it. People have heartburn. We identified it back in the fall, communicated. Rick and I had several meetings on this with a lot of stakeholders. 4 months later, I had someone say, you didn't tell me. We did a lot of communication. It was on decision logs and issues logs. We still got a lot of feedback about that. So again, communicate early, communicate often. Oh, sorry, can you go back? You're getting a little fast there, buddy.
Sorry.
Engage stakeholders throughout the journey. Actually, I just talked to a senior stakeholder the other day, and he didn't realize we reduced, or he forgot that we reduced the scope of one of the rollouts. So again, engaging the stakeholders is throughout the whole journey, checking in as constantly as you can, allowing resources to play. So this is not a quick hit. This is going to take for the initial rollout, about 18 months to 2 years. Some of the stakeholders, even if you're meeting with them on a weekly project meeting, if you're not hitting their site, they're going to forget things. They're not going to necessarily feel connected. So definitely letting the stakeholders play in an environment. Reinforce learning. So one of the things we're doing is we happen to be in the hospital system. And so part of it is once you go to a site that has medical devices, having that site share their learnings as we go to other sites. So they go, this is what we found, this is how we dealt with it. So subsequent rollouts can learn from what happened. Formally kick off each deployment phase. And so with this, I mean, we have several different sites. So it's almost like a project within a project. So when I just kicked off a new site, I had to kick off with all their senior leaders. Even though resources have been engaged throughout the whole time, now we're focusing on them. So really have that time, have very specific dates and deliverables so folks understand what's expected. And then status checks and progress metrics. How do you measure that you're reducing risk, you're making progress in the project? So getting those numbers out there, I happen to be a very visual person, numbers and colors really helps connect your stakeholders.
So once you've kind of got this, what I'm going to call your initial plan built, these are some recommendations that we found worked well when it actually was time to do the implementation. So the first thing you want to start out with, small proof of concept. Certainly if you can do this in your production environment, it will ease some of the hurdles when it comes time to make this bigger. But even if you can't do that, if you start with a switch, a couple of test machines, it need to be fancy, a radio server, you can start getting your feet wet and kind of understanding, okay, I have to run this command first, and then I have to do this, and then I'm going to validate what I've done by following these other steps. Again, this is to begin your true understanding of what you're entailing from a technology perspective. It's one thing to go to the classes, you can read documentation, different story when you're trying to actually get this running in your environment. So once you've got that proof of concept, you've got your feet wet, you've got some confidence in what you're doing, then you want to step up to what I'm going to term a limited production pilot. So what this is a subset of your network, of course, production network, where you're going to get a chance to do the implementation and see what else might be a use case that you didn't think of and design for. So one of the things I also mentioned here, if you can find a spot where the users are 9 to 5, eases the pain. Because you might find out, oh, there's this one switch over here. I didn't realize it hadn't been upgraded from a code perspective in 5 years, and there's a really bad bug that we run into. Okay, well, if you're talking about a place that's 9 to 5, okay, 5:30, I go ahead and do the upgrade, reload the switch, no one's bothered. Versus if you're doing this in a spot that's 24/7, now you're going to have to wait for a change window, and you want to make sure you can keep your keep your motivation and keep your momentum going when it comes to this project. Because as Shannon said, it's not something that you do in 5 minutes. So you have to kind of keep that engagement as high as you can. So once you get the pilot going and run for as long as you can without kind of putting yourself unduly behind, you're going to want to expand out. So I kind of recommend expanding from the place that you were already in versus picking a net new site. Depending upon your environment, you might be forced into a situation in which you have to do that. You can't just expand where you're at. You've got to pick some other place to go, and that can be okay. And then again, you're kind of taking this, taking this huge project and you're kind of slicing it into small chunks. So that way, again, you're going to maintain your momentum. And this is a place where you can engage with your other groups in IT to say, hey, who else might be good early candidates for implementation? Is there, like in our case, we asked and we found on occasion that there were units that were part of like outpatient services. So they didn't have anybody after like 8 o'clock at night. So that was, again, a place we could get going with a minimum of business impact.
Now, one other place I want to mention is throughout this is we had a lot of communication. So every rollout we had, the next morning we had a check-in. We generally found that within the first few hours, the issues were resolved. Often they had to do with the supplicant. So what we did learn very quickly is having a desktop resource on site to fix the issues quickly to minimize the stakeholder impact. We would have a check-in about 11 or 12 every day, make sure things were smooth and we could keep going. What Rick and I did is when we did the pilot, we tried to do 1 closet a night, but when you start with a new site, you might only do 2 a week. So again, it depends on how much time you have for the effort, dollars, resources, et cetera, but always make sure we have communication and also clearly identifying what it means when it is done. So setting clear expectations for all the stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. And then the fun part. So you get this thing, you get it installed, you get it running, you're really happy, and then you're turning it over to support because this is kind of not a one-shot deal. Once you have this, you basically have this forever. This doesn't go away. And you have to bake it into your process going forward. So one of the big hurdles that we ran into is establishing formal processes and not just getting people trained, but being able for everybody to kind of change their understanding of what's now required of them. So as part of this, kind of as you revisit things and as you find things out, kind of don't be afraid to look back at it and go, we did this, we did it a certain way to meet this use case, but in retrospect, if we were to make one more change, it would make that use case easier to deal with, or it would have it cover more situations. So one of the examples that I like to give is when we started the project, we determined and got management approval to set two switch ports in the IT area with no authentication on them, and they were going to be used to image machines. So we thought, that's fairly well. We're kind of limiting what our risk is because we're going to have 2 ports with nothing on them, and we'll kind of go from there. So we went down this road. We got, 3 or 4 sites done before we ran into somebody who said, can you give us more ports? And we said, well, management said approve 2. How many do you need? And the answer came back, well, probably 30. And we're like, ooh, boy. So, so why do you need 30? Well, it turns out they image machines, 10, 20, 30 machines at a time as part of their workflow. So, we talked to them, understand. So, you know what? I said, we'll hold off for now, give us a chance to go back, engage leadership, and say, hey, we've got a new use case that we weren't aware of. What are our options? What can be approved from the intersection of risk and reward here? So, in this particular case, we went back, talked to leadership, and they okayed actually buying a small dedicated switch that would be used with some controls on it to support the PC imaging workflow. So again, we made contact with the enemy, we figured out that our plan didn't work, and then we came with an alternative.
And the other thing to think about with this is governance and operations aren't necessarily fun. So you'll find out some of your resources love the playing and the building, but don't necessarily want to kind of maintain. So kind of keeping that, people motivated, as well as some of the governance might entail taking work away from them, taking ownership and control. So, managing the culture in this space is very important. So ongoing support, who, what, when, why, and where. So we're still working through policies and procedures. We're still in implementation as well as operations. So understanding who makes the decisions. So Rick was in the network security role. We often leveraged security heavily to make those decisions and really kind of work through that. The other thing is from a reporting perspective, we are still building, we're still implementing, so we can show progress against plan, but also how do we demonstrate reduction to risk? So one way is to simply show numbers. We've implemented low impact to number of closets or endpoints, but really kind of getting to the root of what's important and maintaining that as we go forward.
So, and Shannon just touched on, being able to effectively track what is important to you from the technical perspective of the project, as well as the important pieces, the important metrics to your management is absolutely crucial to this. Because again, this is not something that you're going to accomplish in a couple of weeks at a time, unless, if you have an environment, one office, 50 people, one network switch, different story, okay? But we're talking about large networks, large companies, so again, a process that's going to take you a while. So you have to continue to maintain the engagement of your leadership with you in your project. So you want to make sure that you can give them and provide to them the metrics that they need to, to see your progress, be able to support your progress, and also being able to potentially challenge you to say, I saw last week, you guys had, 3 switches done at this site, and this week it's 2, this week now it's still 3, what happened? And that gives you a chance to engage to say, well, we had an issue, or a resource got sick and wasn't available, or our business folks had to put a stop to it because they had something critical come up. Again, you want to keep that engagement as much as you possibly can. And this also gives you a chance to do, again, like I said here, management of the management from the standpoint that giving you a chance to manage some expectations and hopefully put the kibosh on too much goalpost moving. Because again, because the project is long, because it touches a lot of different things, sometimes you might hear, well, why can't we centralize desktop builds at the same time? Or why can't we, fill in the blank and do this other thing? Oh, why can't you ratchet up security faster? Is something that was much asked of us. What do you mean you can't put a bunch more rules on? What do you mean you can't? Well, again, this gives you a chance, again, to engage, to stick to your guns, to say, this is what we designed for, this is what we're going to be able to implement, and if you want us to do additional things, it's going to slow the project down even more, and we're already, the engagement of months and months and months to get this moving to this point. So again, you're going to give them this information and also going to be able to hit them and to show them, what's in it for me? What's in it for your leadership? Because you have to have, I keep saying this because we kept living this, you have to have the engagement of your leadership to make it work. So, and something also I kind of want to point out here, and this is something that I missed until towards the very end, is being able to demonstrate live of what you've done. So, some management is technical, they've got that background, you can talk to them and they understand it when you throw terms out at them. Other management folks may not have that background. They may not be able to understand. And this gives you the chance to say, okay, we've got it running over here, bring your laptop over here and you can see what we're talking about. You can see what the users see. So that way they have the assurance that it works well and there's no unforeseen issues. So when they get that phone call from one of their peers and they say, oh, such and such is doing this thing to us and I don't have the confidence or I'm worried, that way they have the personal experience to respond to say, we've tested extensively, I've tested extensively, we have a high level of confidence that you're not going to have interruptions. You're not going to have business interruptions as we work through this project. So, and you want to show them as many use cases as you can. So you want to show the corporate asset. You want to show, kind of the personal asset, whether it's a phone or a tablet or a PC or what have you, and you want to, again, show them, okay, now try it like this. Oh, now you get the warning page. Oh, now you get this. Oh, now you see the login page. So again, you can build out that level of comfort they have for your project. So in closing, I think I'm going to miss the STFU sign, which is too bad. But so in closing, one of the most important things: communicate, 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 communicate.
Communicate, communicate, communicate.
So, can't stress that enough because, again, length of the project, the amount of complexity involved here, excuse me, and what you're doing is honestly putting controls in places that folks just haven't ever been used to doing that. This by itself isn't going to solve the world's ills, but this is going to give you a foundation as part of an overall strategy to get you to a higher level of sophistication.
Right, and also communicating what the scope is. And earlier about the management of management, I constantly get asked, what are you focused on again? What will be covered? So communicating to your stakeholders and to your resources what is in the scope of this first effort. So Rick and I have always said it's probably going to take about 5 years to fully leverage the tools and the security and reduction of risk for, that what we're using. The initial rollout is close to 2 years. And so when you have that long of a rollout, you have to constantly reinforce with your stakeholders, with your leaders, and with the resources what we are focused on.
And if you take anything away from this talk, and I know Mika this morning said, don't hit the enable content button, communicate.
Yes.
And there's one more cat video because
Yes, so
the world loves cat videos, so
right.
here you go.
And so the theme also with this is herding cats. Because there is multiple work streams going on at one time, people going different directions, people having different priorities, truly to get the work done, and to get the work done well, it's herding cats. Understanding what done means. I had a few interpretations of done with a few of the resources, so getting to done, herding cats, and communicating the heck out of the project.
So we have some time for questions. If anyone has any questions, certainly this is the time to shout them out. Sir?
Thanks. Sorry, I missed the first few minutes of did you cover, so you're introducing segmentation into a network reproduction. Did you talk about at all about the segmentation mechanisms on layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, and pros and cons of leveraging capabilities in each of those layers of ordering or circumstances in which you favor one or the other?
We didn't cover that because we were trying to focus more on the business side versus the technical side. But certainly, in this actually particular engagement, we used a couple different methodologies to do that. So in the environments that we were going into, we did lots of stuff that was layer 2 and layer 3 focused. So stuff like VLAN assignments, access list changes. We did a little bit of security group tags, which to this point is a proprietary Cisco offering. Did WebAuth redirects, basically captive portals, and did some of that. So it was a mix and match of, so partly it's what your infrastructure can do, what fits your security policies and postures and desires, certainly, and then how effectively you can roll that out. Because one of the things that we found is because of the infrastructure was fairly different from one site to the next, it wasn't like we could say, okay, well, by default, you're going to go into VLAN 10, let's say, automatically, because in our case, there was no standardization on VLANs. So we couldn't say, well, go to the user VLAN, go to VLAN 10. Well, all the VLANs were named different, and they had different numbers. So in our scenario, we did a minimum of dynamic VLAN assignments. It was mostly other options in that case. Like I said, the same thing like you want to do VRFs, for instance. In our environment, they wouldn't be very useful because we were mostly a layer 2 environment. Yeah, didn't have to do that because, again, if you had, let's say you have an environment that's heavily, let's say it's heavily layer 3, might be a different story. And again, I think part of a point that we probably didn't make as well as we should have is getting a good understanding of your environment, so you're going to be able to fit your offering effectively to what you need. Sir?
Did you have to deal with issues like bringing your own device and you have to solve certain aspects of devices that are not secure?
So we did do some BYOD issues. So one of the things I touched on briefly was the Macintoshes. So in the environment that we were in, There was no official Macintoshes. So if you asked the party line is that we have no Apple devices. That was the party line. Wasn't true, but that was the party line. So that was kind of one of the things. In that case, it was members of the IT staff that were known to have them. So we were able to work with them to say, okay, you need to make these changes and you can get access. When it came to personal devices like the CISO's iPad, for instance, that belongs to him and doesn't belong to the company, we worked through a couple different ways to get him access. And that was one of the pieces that we found was an organizational challenge because we had to get policies with teeth in them to put the technical aspects in. So in our case, I found the technical stuff was actually easier to deal with than the front-end policy pieces. Any other questions? Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you for listening to us.
Thank you.